Here's an engaging overview that builds intrigue without revealing the key events. In a city where thousands of strangers cross paths every minute, one fearless young woman has turned the chaos of the streets into her greatest weapon. Quick-witted, fearless, and impossible to catch, Sia survives by trusting nothing but her instincts. But fate has a different plan when her path unexpectedly crosses with Atharv, a wealthy, powerful businessman whose pride is as enormous as his fortune. What begins as an ordinary afternoon in a crowded marketplace soon sets off a chain of events that neither of them could have imagined. A single moment, one unexpected encounter, and two completely different worlds are about to collide in a story filled with tension, wit, and unforgettable twists. Episode 1. Atharv Chaudhary was one of those people whose face carried far less of a smile and far more of arrogance. To him, the world was divided into only two parts, himself and everyone else. His mother had passed away when he was a child. His father taught him business, but never taught him love. As a result, Atharv came to treat money as his parents, his friends, and even his god. Being the sole heir to a company worth hundreds of millions, he had never learned to hear the word no while growing up. Whatever toy caught his attention would be lying in his room the very next moment. Any car he happened to admire would be parked in his garage by the following week. Gradually, this habit became an inseparable part of his personality. He began to believe that everything in the world had a price, and if it didn't, a price could always be created. To him, people were less like human beings and more like transactions waiting to happen. Even relationships were investments in his eyes. Wherever he saw profit, he showed interest. Wherever he sensed loss, he walked away without ever looking back. There was always a smug, conceited smile on his face, as though the very thought of someone considering themselves his equal was laughable. What shone in his eyes was not confidence, but arrogance, an arrogance that found pleasure in making others feel insignificant. He had another habit as well. Anything that caught his fancy had to become his, no matter what it took. It made no difference whether it was an expensive car, a business deal, a piece of land, or the dream someone had built through years of hard work. If he believed something ought to belong to him, he would not rest until he possessed it. Law, morality, right and wrong, those were words that existed only inside books as far as he was concerned. In real life, he recognized only one law, his own desire. Money was the greatest power in his world, and he never hesitated to use that power. If an employee dared to contradict him, that employee would lose their job within the hour. If a businessman attempted to stand against him, Atharv would simply buy out the rival business and shut it down. His enemies feared him, and his friends, they were hardly friends at all, merely people orbiting around his wealth. Yet none of this bothered Atharv in the slightest. He believed respect was never earned, it was bought. That was why he never tried to win people's hearts. He preferred to purchase their helplessness instead. There was such authority in the way he walked that it seemed as though every road belonged exclusively to him. Tailor-made suits, luxury watches, imported cars, and a convoy of bodyguards were all part of the status he carried. Yet behind all of that stood a man who had never truly been challenged. That was why he was not proud of his victories. He was proud of having become accustomed to winning. Bowing his head before anyone was, in his eyes, the greatest humiliation imaginable. His tongue was sharper than a sword, and his replies were so cutting that people thought twice before speaking in front of him. Other people's emotions meant absolutely nothing to him. If tears welled up in someone's eyes, he dismissed them as a sign of weakness. And if someone dared to stand firm against him, he saw it only as another opportunity to display his power. People often said that Atharv possessed everything: wealth, influence, prestige, and reputation. But the one thing he had never possessed was humanity. Perhaps he had never even felt its absence, because he had always believed that in this world, the true victor is the one who has the most money and the least mercy. This translation preserves the original meaning, tone, characterization, and narrative flow while keeping the length and emotional impact very close to the Hindi version. Now, let me introduce you to Sia, the queen of lane number 13, the princess of pickpockets, and the biggest headache the orphanage had ever known. Her name is Sia, but the entire marketplace salutes her by the nickname, the pickpocket thief. She is around 20 or 21 years old, barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, yet carries herself with such swagger that even a 6-foot wrestler would instinctively take 2 steps back. Her round, lively eyes are always dancing around as though currents of mischief are constantly running through them. A ponytail swinging behind her and a crooked smile permanently resting on her lips, as if she were silently warning everyone, "Better watch your wallet, buddy." Sia just walked past. The story of this little pickpocket thief began on the day Sia was only 3 years old. Her parents died in a tragic accident, and the moment her relatives realized she was a girl, they turned their backs on her. Her elder uncle grabbed her father's 2 bighas of land and abandoned Sia at the gates of an orphanage, saying, "She's a girl, she's nothing but a burden." But Sia was never someone who accepted being called a burden. She made the orphanage walls her own sky. The matron would scold her, and Sia would simply whistle in return. If there wasn't enough food, she would make everyone laugh so hard that half-filled stomachs felt like a feast. Crying was something she never seemed to know, or perhaps she had pickpocketed even her own tears and chased them away. There are 2 things Sia absolutely hates: begging before anyone, and working a 9-to-5 job. She says, "Living tied down like that is no different from dying, yaar. I want freedom, the complete kind, the kind without conditions." And the price of that freedom? She earns it with the magic in her fingertips. She slips into a crowd, lightly bumps into someone, and before they even realize it, their wallet has vanished from their pocket. Her hands are so unbelievably swift and clean that even a magician would lose to her. Of course, Sia isn't alone. She has her own gang: Chotu, Tillu, Pinky, and Kalu. None of them call her Didi. They call her leader. And what a leader she is. She always steps into danger first before letting her gang take their share. The moment a police jeep appears, Sia is the one standing in front with her chest held high. The local people were already exhausted because of her, but the police suffered even more. Every other day, Sia somehow ended up at the police station. Since she belonged to the orphanage, there was never anyone to come and bail her out, so eventually the officers had to release her themselves. They had watched Sia grow up since childhood, and because they still saw her as that troublesome little girl, they always let her go. In a strange way, they had developed an odd bond with her. For Sia, the police station had practically become a second home. The station officer had scolded her countless times. "Hey, girl, straighten your life out." But Sia would immediately shoot back. "Uncle, if I become a good girl, then who will you arrest? How will you ever get promoted?" With that, she'd stick out her tongue, laugh, and disappear around the street corner before anyone could react. Money. Sometimes she has 10,000 rupees in her pocket, sometimes only 10. But her attitude is always worth millions. Ripped jeans, a crop top, a cheap pendant hanging around her neck. Yet she walks with such confidence that even fashion models strolling through luxury malls would look ordinary beside her. If some wealthy businessman stared at her for too long, Sia would simply wink and say, "Thinking of buying me? Your pocket isn't rich enough." Despite being a girl, she throws around rough street slang that would put most boys to shame, and even the toughest of them lower their heads and answer, "Yes, leader." But Sia isn't made of stone. For the children at the orphanage, she is nothing less than Robin Hood. Whenever she pulls off a big score, the evening ends with samosas, jalebis, and brand new teddy bears for every child. She herself may continue walking around in torn slippers, but she won't rest until little Gudiya has a brand new school bag. If anyone ever mentions her elder uncle or aunt, Sia simply laughs it off and says, "The people who threw me away don't deserve to dirty my mouth with their names. This lane is my family. This gang is my family." Sia lives by one simple rule. She will never pick the pocket of a poor person, and she will never rob someone who is helpless. Only the rich, the arrogant, the people who treat everyone else like insects. Making their pockets lighter is practically a good deed. Sometimes, late at night, she lies on the rooftop counting the stars and quietly wonders what life would have been like if her parents had still been alive. Then she immediately shakes her head and mutters to herself, "Hey, Sia, don't get emotional. You are a thief." A thief's eyes aren't meant to hold tears. They are meant to spot other people's wallets. She wasn't merely the leader of her gang. She was the biggest menace in the entire neighborhood. Her tongue was so sharp that while the other person was still thinking of one reply, Sia had already fired off 4 fresh taunts. If some local thug blocked her way, instead of getting scared she would grab him by the collar and ask, "What's the matter, huh? Did your father buy this road?" And if the fellow showed even more attitude, her entire gang would be standing behind him before he could blink. Money never stayed in her hands for long, yet anyone watching her style would assume she was the spoiled daughter of some once rich family. Though the truth was obvious from her appearance alone. Her confidence was her greatest wealth. Whether she wore ripped jeans or a cheap kurta, she carried herself as though she were about to walk the runway at an international fashion show. Her biggest rule in life was simple: keep your heart open, keep your feet moving fast, and if luck doesn't stand by your side, well, there are always pockets waiting to be picked. And yes, Sia is afraid of absolutely no one. Whether it's a minister's son or the biggest gangster in the area, everyone gets the same warning: stay within your limits, or next time, I'll steal your dignity along with your wallet. She is bubbly, mischievous, outspoken to a fault, yet completely pure at heart. Freedom is the air she breathes, and mischief is her signature style. If Atharv is the king of money, then Sia is the uncrowned queen of her streets. They are complete opposites, entirely different in every possible way. One has never learned how to bow, while the other has never learned how to stop. Now let's see what happens when they finally collide. Does wealth win, or does unstoppable charm? Episode 2. It was early afternoon. On the busiest road in the city, life was racing forward as it always did. Shops lined the sidewalks, street vendors shouted at the top of their lungs to attract customers, the blaring horns of buses, the roaring engines of motorcycles, the voices of people bargaining, and the endless stream of the crowd all blended together into such overwhelming noise that the presence of any single individual seemed to lose all meaning. This crowd was Sia's world. The very crowd that looked like chaos to everyone else was her shield of protection. Her face was innocent. She could not have been more than 20 or 22 years old. There was a playful spark in her eyes, and such effortless agility in her movements that every turn of the crowd felt familiar to her long before she reached it. Over the years, she had mastered the art of judging the weight of a man's pocket simply by the way he walked, identifying whose watch was genuine, whose wallet rested inside a pocket, and who was so deeply lost in his own world that he had no awareness of the people around him. She never stayed in one place for long. Brushing against someone while walking, flashing an apologetic smile, and disappearing into the crowd the very next moment, that was her signature. A short distance away, parked beside the same road, stood a gleaming black luxury car, but its hood was raised. The driver kept trying to inspect the engine while speaking to the service center over the phone. The owner of the car, Atharv, stood by the roadside with anger burning across his face. Waiting was the greatest punishment for him. In his world, everything moved according to his command: people, money, time, and even circumstances themselves. But today, an ordinary machine had brought his arrogance to a halt in the middle of the street. After sharply scolding the driver into silence, he began calling for another car himself. An expensive tailored suit, a gleaming wristwatch, the latest smartphone in his hand, and that unmistakable arrogance on his face made it clear to anyone who looked at him that he considered himself far above the rest of the world. Even while talking on the phone, every word carried the tone of an order, as though the person on the other end was not an employee but a servant. His complete attention remained fixed on the conversation, while his eyes occasionally wandered toward the vehicles passing along the road. Meanwhile, Sia moved through the crowd like a hunter searching for prey in a dense forest. Her gaze settled briefly on one face after another before moving on. Then her eyes landed on Atharv. The expensive suit, the slight bulge in his pocket, a man completely absorbed in his phone, and no one around paying him any special attention. She maintained her distance for a brief moment and studied him carefully. Years of experience had already taught her that people like him, intoxicated by their own wealth, were always the most careless. Without showing the slightest hint of haste, she altered her pace. First, She stopped beside a nearby shop and pretended to examine the merchandise with casual interest. Then, little by little, she allowed the flow of the crowd to carry her in the same direction where Atharv was standing. That same innocent smile rested upon her face, the kind of smile that made it impossible for anyone to imagine she could ever be a pickpocket. Suddenly, a vegetable vendor's cart brushed lightly against a motorcycle. A few tomatoes rolled across the road, and people instinctively shifted in different directions to avoid bumping into one another. This was precisely the moment Sia had been waiting for. Blending seamlessly into the confusion of the crowd, she quickened her pace. She first brushed lightly against one man, then stepped aside to let another person pass, and within moments she had reached right beside Atharv. He was still speaking sharply into his phone. "The car should be here in 10 minutes. I don't wait." At that exact instant, Sia's right hand reached the pocket of his trousers as lightly and silently as a passing breeze. Her fingers were so delicate and perfectly controlled that the fabric did not even tighten enough for him to notice. With just 2 fingers, she caught the edge of his wallet, gave it the slightest twist, and in one smooth, practiced motion slipped it out of his pocket. At the very same moment, she gently bumped his shoulder with her other hand, as though she had merely lost her balance because of the crowd pushing around her. "Sorry," she murmured softly. The very next second, she melted back into the crowd as effortlessly as a drop of color dissolves into water. The entire job had taken no more than 3 seconds. Atharv continued his conversation without the slightest interruption. He did not even realize that his pocket had suddenly become lighter. About 5 minutes later, a second car arrived there. Atharv slipped his hand toward his pocket to put away his phone, but his fingers touched nothing except empty fabric. He checked the other pocket, then the inside pocket of his coat, then every pocket of his trousers. The color drained from his face within a moment. He carefully searched every pocket once again, but the wallet was nowhere to be found. The very next instant, his face turned red with fury. The price of the wallet itself meant nothing to him. The cards worth millions, his identity documents, and the cash inside could all be replaced. But someone had picked his pocket right under his nose, while he was standing there. It was a direct strike against his pride. Episode 10. At the far end of the alley stood Sia. Both of her hands were being held tightly by Atharv's men. Even so, there was more irritation than fear on her face, as though what angered her most was that someone had dared to stop her against her will. Atharv slowly walked toward her. His expensive shoes made soft sounds against the broken stones beneath his feet. A heavy silence settled over the entire alley. Even the people standing nearby had realized that this was no ordinary quarrel. For the first time, Atharv looked at the girl from so close. A dusky, innocent-looking face, messy hair, an unusual sparkle in her eyes, and that same insolent smile resting on her lips. He could hardly believe that such a small-looking girl had picked his pocket and walked away without a trace of worry. The very next moment, that realization wounded his pride even more deeply. He stopped right in front of Sia. Their eyes met. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Even the air seemed to come to a standstill. Then Atharv said in an extremely low but icy voice, "How did you dare pick my pocket?" Sia looked him up and down. There was neither fear nor regret in her eyes. Tilting her head slightly, she replied, "It was a pocket, so it got picked. What's the big deal?" The men standing behind Atharv stared at her in disbelief. Perhaps it was the first time anyone had spoken to their boss in such a manner. Atharv clenched his fists. "Do you even know who you are talking to?" Sia shrugged with a laugh. "No, and to be honest, I have no interest in finding out. I come across 2 or 4 arrogant men like you on the streets every day. Wearing expensive clothes doesn't make anyone a king." The moment she said that, one of Atharv's men tightened his grip on her hand in anger. Ignoring the pain, Sia glared straight at him. "Loosen your grip. My hand shouldn't end up broken." There was such fearless defiance in her voice that, for a brief moment, even the man was taken aback. Atharv's face had now turned completely expressionless. Those who knew him understood that his most dangerous side was not when he shouted, but when he became calm. He stepped one pace closer. Where's my wallet? Probably spent by now. It's not like I go around keeping accounts. Don't lie. And what if I am? What exactly are you going to do? As she said those words, Sia locked eyes with him. The challenge in her voice was impossible to miss. She still had no idea that the man standing before her was one of the most influential people in the city. To her, he was nothing more than another rich, arrogant man intoxicated by his wealth. Atharv drew a deep breath. Do you know what your biggest mistake is? Yeah. Sia smiled. Stopping to waste my time talking to a man like you. The faces of the men around Atharv burned with fury. No one had ever dared insult him like this. But Sia wasn't finished yet. Her gaze shifted to Atharv's expensive suit, and with a mocking smile she said, "The suit must be worth millions, but it seems your brains are rented. It took you this long to realize your pocket had been picked." A couple of people standing in the alley smiled involuntarily, but the very next second, under the intimidating stares of Atharv's men, they immediately lowered their eyes. Those few words struck Atharv's pride like a hammer. The loss of money meant nothing to him. But having someone stand before him and mock him so openly, that was a direct blow to his self-respect. The anger in his eyes faded, replaced by a dangerously cold stillness. For several seconds, he stared at Sia without blinking. Then, in a very quiet voice, he said, "You think you've won?" Sia answered with complete indifference, "So far, that's exactly what it looks like." A faint smile appeared on Atharv's lips, but it wasn't a smile of happiness. It was the smile of a man who had already made a decision in his mind. Without even looking at his men, he uttered just one word, "Take her." The very next moment, two men stepped forward. Sia jerked sharply, trying to free her hands, but their grip was far too strong. "Hey! Let me go," she shouted, pulling with all her strength. "Who do you people think you are to grab me like this?" She shoved one of the men hard while trying to break free, but the other instantly blocked her path. Undeterred, Sia continued resisting. Her breathing had grown heavy, yet the same spirit of rebellion still blazed in her eyes. "If you've got any guts, face me yourself. You needed 4 men to do this." Atharv simply watched her without saying a word. The anger had vanished from his face, replaced by an unyielding resolve. "You still don't understand," he said in a calm voice. "You didn't just pick my pocket, you challenged my pride." Sia shot back without hesitation, "If your pride is that cheap, how is that my fault?" Hearing those words, Atharv lost his patience for the very first time. "Enough." His voice echoed through the entire alley. "From today onward, you'll learn the price of insulting someone." At his signal, his men began dragging Sia away by force. She struggled with all the strength she had, resisting every step of the way, but both numbers and strength were against her. The people in the alley watched everything unfold, yet not a single one found the courage to step forward. Within moments, the door of the black SUV slammed shut, the engine roared to life, and the vehicle sped out of the deserted alley. All that remained behind was a cloud of dust. For the first time, he realized that someone had made a fool out of him. That realization spread through him like wildfire. He clenched his fists in rage. His eyes carried the same look as those of a wounded lion. It was not the loss of money that burned him from within, but the sting of defeat. Atharv immediately called his men. Within a few minutes, several SUVs pulled up along the road. His men, dressed in black, spread throughout the entire street. Shopkeepers were questioned, passers-by were stopped, and every shop equipped with a CCTV camera was approached. Atharv himself went from one shop to another. He did not wait for any police officer because he was one of those men who trusted their own influence far more than the law. There was such pressure in his voice that no shopkeeper dared refuse to show him the camera footage. Every recording was played. In some clips, only the crowd could be seen. In others, his own face appeared. Then, in one camera's recording, the exact moment was captured when Sia had reached him along with the crowd. The footage was slowed down. Every eye in the room remained fixed on the screen. The very next second, It became crystal clear. A slender young girl, an innocent face, a faint smile, two fingers moving with astonishing speed, and Atharv's wallet disappearing from his pocket. Silence engulfed the shop for a few moments. Atharv watched the footage again and again. With every replay, the anger in his eyes grew even darker. "Find this girl," he said through clenched teeth. "Search every single corner of this city. Wherever she's hiding, I want her alive." His men scattered in different directions without wasting even a second. For the next several hours, they searched the old marketplaces, narrow alleys, bus terminals, sidewalks, and every place where pickpockets were known to come and go. Atharv himself refused to sit still. For him, this was no longer about recovering his wallet. It had become a matter of his prestige, his izzat-e-nafs, his self-respect. He felt that if he failed to catch that girl today, people would no longer speak of his power. Instead, they would tell stories about his helplessness. And Atharv could never allow that to happen. Evening slowly descended. The narrow lanes of the old city began glowing beneath dim yellow bulbs. Just then, one of his men called, "Sir, we've found the girl." Without wasting a moment, Atharv drove straight there. At the end of the alley stood Sia. Both of her hands were firmly restrained by his men. Even so, there was more defiance than fear on her face. Atharv slowly walked up and stopped in front of her. It was the first time he had seen the girl from up close. So tiny, so slender, with such an innocent-looking face, and yet she was the one who had picked the pocket of a man like him. For a brief moment, he could hardly believe it. But the very next moment, that realization only inflamed his pride even further. He felt that he had not been humiliated by a seasoned criminal, but by this tiny, innocent-looking young girl. The veins on his face tightened. Locking his eyes onto hers, he said in an exceptionally calm yet dangerously cold voice, "Do you have the slightest idea whose pocket you picked?" In response, Sia simply looked back into his eyes. She neither lowered her head nor apologized. Instead, a faint smile appeared on her lips. That single smile became the greatest insult Atharv had ever endured. At that very moment, he made a silent vow to himself that this score would not be settled merely by getting his wallet back. From now on, this was a battle for his izzat-e-nafs, his honor, his pride, and he was the kind of man who never rested until he had taken revenge for every defeat he suffered. English 4. Atharv's men had both of Sia's hands gripped tightly. In that deserted section of the old factory, only the dim yellow light of a flickering tube light was burning. Rusted iron machines, broken walls, and the heavy silence spread all around created an atmosphere capable of breaking anyone's courage. Sia was shoved onto an old iron chair. Her hands were tied behind her back. The ropes were pulled so tight that within minutes her wrists had turned red. Yet she did not complain about the pain even once. She only looked at Atharv, who was standing in front of her. There was no fear in her eyes, only that same stubborn, mischievous defiance that had once again ignited the anger inside him. Atharv walked toward her slowly. He placed his expensive wallet on the table and stared at Sia without blinking. The men standing around the room immediately understood that their boss had not come merely to reclaim what belonged to him. This had become a matter of his pride. In a calm, almost whisper-like voice, he said, "Do you have any idea how much this wallet is worth?" Without wasting a second, Sia replied, "Not nearly as much as what's written all over your face." Every man in the room instinctively glanced at the others. No one had ever dared to speak to Atharv in that tone, especially not in a situation like this. Atharv clenched his jaw. He took one more step toward her but stopped himself. He did not want to lose control and shout in anger. He wanted Sia to break on her own, to bow before him willingly. He looked at his men and simply said, "Leave her here. Don't hit her. Don't lay a hand on her. Just let her realize how expensive stubbornness can be." His men understood immediately. They untied her hands but forced her to remain standing in the middle of the room. A bottle of water had been placed in one corner of the room, just far enough that she could not reach it no matter how hard she tried. Hours passed. Pain slowly spread through Sia's legs. Her knees began to tremble. Her lips became dry. Every now and then, one of the men would walk over and say, "Just apologize, and you'll get to go home." Every single time, Sia simply smiled faintly and looked away. Night had fallen completely when Atharv returned to the room. He saw that Sia was still standing exactly where he had left her. Her face had turned pale with exhaustion. Her hair was disheveled. Tiny beads of sweat glistened across her forehead. Her legs were trembling violently, yet she had not bent her knees even once. Atharv pulled a chair in front of her and sat down. He picked up the bottle of water, unscrewed the cap, and said, "Just one word. I lost. After that, you'll get water, food, and your freedom." For a few moments, Sia's dry eyes remained fixed on the bottle. Her throat burned with thirst. Her body was giving up. But the very next moment, she looked away from the bottle and locked her eyes onto Atharv's. In a tired, quiet voice, she said, "Thirst can make a person weak, but never dishonest." Without saying another word, Atharv placed the bottle back on the table. For the very first time, confusion appeared on his face. Throughout his life, he had encountered very few people who could not be bent by money, fear, or temptation. He stood up, walked to the window, and remained silent for a few moments. Then he turned back and asked, "Do you really think you are winning?" A faint smile appeared on Sia's lips. Even that smile trembled with pain. "The day I become afraid, that's the day you'll win." Once again, something inside Atharv burst into flames. He grabbed his wallet from the table and hurled it onto the floor. "You gambled your life over this worthless thing," he shouted. Sia did not even glance at the wallet. She simply said, "It may be worthless to you, but to me, it's my work, my business. And I remain deeply honest toward my work." A sarcastic smile curved across Sia's face. For a moment, the entire room fell silent. Even Atharv's men stood speechless. Atharv gestured to his men. They forced Sia back onto the chair. He stepped so close that only a few inches separated them, then leaned down and said, "Think carefully until tomorrow morning. Either lower your head and apologize, or I'll hand you over to the police. Getting out from there won't be easy." Slowly, Sia looked down at her bruised wrists before raising her eyes toward Atharv again. Her face reflected exhaustion and pain, yet that strange sparkle still burned within her eyes. In an unbelievably calm voice, she said, "You can imprison me, you can frighten me, but my defeat won't happen just because you say so. I'll lose only on the day I admit that I bowed before the wrong person." Atharv continued staring at her for several long moments. He wanted the girl sitting before him to cry, to beg, to plead for mercy. But the longer he stood in front of her, the more he realized something unsettling. This girl could be broken by pain, but she would never compromise with her self-respect. That very realization was awakening not only anger inside him but also an unwilling curiosity. For the first time, he felt that this battle was no longer merely between a pickpocket and her victim. There was something fascinating hidden inside this girl, something that made her different from everyone else and, at the same time, kept drawing his attention toward her. Atharv was still lost in those thoughts when suddenly his phone began to ring. The moment he read the name flashing on the caller ID, his face instantly turned as hard and expressionless as stone. He cast one brief glance at Sia before signaling his men. "Make her stand on one leg the entire night. She doesn't get food, not even a single drop of water. And in the morning, throw her back exactly where you picked her up from." He deliberately emphasized the word throw, as though Sia were nothing more than a piece of garbage that needed to be tossed back onto a trash heap to clean up the filth. The word was meant to humiliate her. And the moment Sia heard it, her face genuinely flushed crimson with humiliation. She glared at him with her deep golden eyes, as though blazing fireballs would erupt from them and reduce Atharv to ashes where he stood. But Atharv no longer paid much attention to her. To him, the name glowing on his caller ID at that moment was far more important. Without another glance back, he turned and strode out of the factory with swift, determined steps. Next episode coming soon.